Welcome to the Deep Blue on My Doorstep podcast. I'm Tracy Ainsworth from the University of New South Wales. In this podcast series, we will talk to marine experts about the marine environments that we have right on our doorsteps and what we can do to help conserve and protect these blue spaces. Dr. Dana Bergstrom, Antarctic scientist with the Australian Antarctic Division. It is such a pleasure to have you join us for the Deep Blue on My Doorstep podcast. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Tracy. It's lovely to be here.
I'm really grateful for your time today. Your record and achievements in Antarctic science are so broad, it's a challenge to introduce you in just a few sentences. But I'm going to give it a go anyway. Let's see how I go. I have just 20 seconds to try and get through as many highlights of your career as possible. Here we go. 37 years studying Antarctic science. First female scientist in Australia to spend an entire career in Antarctica and Antarctic science. Investigator of 22 Antarctic science research programs. You wrote and produced the professional musical theatre show Antarctica. Principal scientist at Australian Antarctic Division. Over 100 peer-reviewed articles focused on Antarctica. 2020 nominee with the Australian Eureka Awards with the Eco Antarctic team. Leader of Aliens in Antarctica program and founder of the Pure Antarctic Foundation. That's phenomenal. And I think that's just the highlights. Your research has focused on Antarctica and subantarctic territories. It seems to me that you've spent most of your time in these places. These are the places that are on your doorstep. You started studying Macquarie Island in your master's degree, and you haven't really looked back since. What captured your imagination that first time you stepped onto these remote islands and remote blue spaces?
I can remember the time really clearly. I had this opportunity to get to Macquarie Island, which is 1,200 kilometres south east of Tasmania, and I was standing in a field hut and I went to go and explore a penguin colony, and I took my notebook and I was amazed. Instead of just taking a photo, I decided to sketch these penguins. They're royal penguins and they have these little tufts of feathers sticking out of their ears that look pretty amazing. And as I was drawing these penguins and going, wow, it suddenly occurred to me that I wasn't in Australia anymore and that I'd been transported to somewhere completely different, and it was so exciting. And that was it. That just totally enchanted me and fascinated me. And yeah, it gets under your skin.
And it's still new to you every time you go?
Every time. I spent this summer, the summer just passed, in Antarctica proper, in the Vestervold Hills, and I had 4 months down there roaming these very, very moonscape-like hills and finding algae under little rocks, little quartz rocks, and finding lichens and mosses, and every day was such a thrill.
You spent several months down in Antarctica on an expedition this year. After a lifetime spent in these really remote places, what was really novel and new for you this year?
It was a place I'd only visited once before, and so it was exciting to really get to know an environment and try and understand how things were functioning. One of the things that was novel and important was I got to be there when it rained, and we don't think of rain in Antarctica, but one of the things that really helps you understand how an ecosystem works is to be there when it's really, really an extreme weather event. And so to be there when it rained and then to see the impact of the flood helps you understand what the drivers are of how an ecosystem works. It's one of the big questions that sort of follows on in my career is how does an ecosystem function? How do the plants live? How do the animals live? How do things work in nature? And so to be there at an extreme event and something so bizarre as rain in Antarctica, it was really, really important to be there, and also magical because when it rained, we were at a lake and kept hearing these sort of like little shards of glass breaking or something, some like tinkling of crystals, and I couldn't quite understand why that was the sound of rain. until I realized that there was a layer of ice just under the water of the lake that we were standing next to. And as the rain came down, it was tinkling on the ice. And I was like, wow, what a sound. I'd never heard it before.
Wow, that's absolutely amazing. What was it like to see somewhere covered in ice flood?
Shocking. um, but at the same time, I was at a site that we had been, well, as in colleagues and I'd been tracking through photographs, and the photographs were now over 20 years old. And over that time, there was a moss bed, and mosses are really rare in Antarctica. We think of Antarctica being covered in ice, but in these little ice-free pockets around the coast, you might get conditions suitable to allow a moss to grow. It's like the biggest thing in Antarctica. Though in the tail bit that sticks out of Antarctica, you can find a grass and you can find a little tiny, a little herb. But
Yeah.
in the parts below Australia and Africa and India, the biggest thing you're going to find is a moss. And this was one of those moss beds areas, and they're very, very rare. And when sort of uh, senior colleagues, like the last generation of scientists, people that were like my PhD supervisor and her colleagues. So my lecturers at university who'd been there 30 years ago, they had photos of these lush moss banks. And over the last 20 years, there'd been photos showing it just slowly degrading and going, getting sicker and sicker and sicker with climate change as these plants dried out. And I'd been there in December, and I'd wanted to go back in January to see if they got even sicker as it got hotter in the summer. But here it was raining and it'd been melting for a few weeks, and a lot of the plants had recovered
Oh,
and they were
wow.
bright green. And so the flood was coming from the lake as the glacier close by was melting, flooding the lake, and then the water was seeping up onto these moss banks. And I had photos from a month before of things looking really, really dead, and suddenly there were patches of green and life and recovery. And so that was pretty exciting to see. But the plants that didn't get the wicking of the water from the lake still look pretty sick and dying.
Some of
But
your research has documented drought as well through these places.
yes, they have. And so, and this looked like, 20 years of drought and an extreme event, which was part of climate change. But here it was a little bit of a positive event where some of the plants were getting water and looking healthy, and other parts still in the Vestervold Hills, which is about 400 kilometres squared. They didn't get the rain, or if they did, it wasn't enough, and they were still looking like they'd been drought affected and what we call moribund, which means not
Yeah.
very healthy.
Yeah. When these systems are starting to go through that decline, and like you said, you saw a lot of places where these rare moss beds were dying back, what does recovery look like if, for example, you don't get a flood event?
Well, the thing is that what we thought, obviously some things were dead and they didn't recover, but some things just look sick and dry. But the magic things about Antarctic mosses is they have the capacity to just be in a state of just dried out, freeze dried, but they're still alive. And this showed that a little bit of water and they could, recover. So it's what we call a resurrection plant, in that they can hang in there for long periods of time, and then just a little bit of good conditions, and then they can grow, a few more leaves, and maybe that will allow them to survive until the next time. But the problem that we have seen is that things fall over, and this is the sad thing that we've found on the sub-Antarctic islands, where we tracked that a cushion plant. This is now a flowering plant, ones that produces little flowers, and it's really important in the alpine areas of this island called Macquarie Island. It had gone for 17 seasons in a row, where the amount of water sort of evaporating from the soil was greater than the amount coming in from rain. And these plants just tolerated and tolerated and tolerated not having enough water in their growing season, and then all of a sudden they fell over.
Yeah.
And I was there, a place I'd known really, really well, and it was at Christmas time, and I was walking back to station along this plateau, and I was just about to go down this really steep gully to get to the beach and say hello to the elephant seals and then walk to the research station where you live on Macquarie Island. And ever since I was a young grad student, there was this cushion that I knew because it looked like the shape of the island. And every time I was walking on the track and you're tired, you've been walking all day, and all of a sudden you see the map of the island and you go, I'm close to the point where I jump down and get back to the beach. And I came along and I saw my map, and my map, so this map is made up of plants that look like an island. And all of a sudden, it's like there was bits out of it, and then bits were dead in it. And I went, what's wrong?
Yeah.
And then I started to look around, and even though I'd been there for, it was Christmas time, and the plants go from brown to green because they come out of their winter, winter dormancy. And then I looked around and went, I can't say it on a podcast, but there was some swear words in there.
Yeah.
Because I looked around and went, something's not right here. And then you get your eye in, because this area is what we call, it's a tundra-like environment. It's like there's lots of gravel, and so there's lots of bare ground anyway, and there's mosses, and there are these giant big cushion plants that look like giant green balloons. And a lot of them were brown, and they hadn't come out of winter. And now it's Christmas time. It's like, of course they've got to be out of winter now. It's we're spring, summer.
Yeah.
And then I realised some were grey and dead. And so it had happened, at least 2 seasons beforehand. And what we now term this is dieback. And it's been really, really sad because these plants hadn't had enough water for 17 years, and all of a sudden they just fell over.
Yeah.
And then what happened, so the water's come back because we're in what's called an El Nino. It was dry for 17 seasons in a row, and now there's been a La Nina since over the last decade. So there's been enough water, but these plants haven't recovered because when you're stressed, sometimes you get sick. It happens in humans and it happens in plants, and I'm sure it happens in corals.
Yeah.
That often diseases emerge, and in this case, what looks potentially like a fungus has emerged, and that's ravaged these plants for the last decade. And so even though there's enough water, the plants are still dying, and the plant went from really, really healthy. It's an endemic cushion plant. You only find it on Macquarie Island, and now it's threatened. It's facing extinction, and that happened in 3 years. So a plant went from healthy to critically endangered in 3 years, and that's a really scary message and it was shocking to see, because at the same time on the island, there'd been this explosion of rabbits, because it's one of feral animals, and suddenly there was money available, and they're eradicating the rabbits and the rats and the mice, and the biggest eradication program anywhere in the world, and it was successful over a few years. And so the coastal bits of the island are recovering magnificently because these feral animals are no longer there, and they're not eating the seeds, and they're not eating the spiders, and they're not actually just eating the plants. So on the coast, you see this magnificent recovery, but on the top of the islands, you're seeing death and the wind blowing these plants away.
That's incredible, because for most people, you think that these places are so remote, so difficult to access, that they're almost untouchable by humans. But you're talking about climate change, disease, and pests in somewhere so remote, completely changing how an ecosystem has structured for so long.
Yeah, and you can understand why the pests were there. The pests came out of a good idea. So you had sailing ships passing all these islands, and there's a lot of islands around Australia. And in case someone got shipwrecked there, they went, there's got to be some food. So they dropped off rabbits on these islands. as a potential food source without understanding what rabbits do to island ecosystems. And then when the ships were in, everyone had a ship's cat, and some of those ship's cats went ashore. Ships always had rats and mice, and they too went ashore with stores and things like that. So they were accidental introductions, but it happens to lots of islands around Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah.
But we're now learning how to remove them, and allow, because one of the things about the cats and the rats and the mice was they would get into penguins, they'd get into these seabirds, these petrels, and
Yeah.
wreak havoc in the the ecosystems that are there, and the species that rely on these little islands as their place for resting and breeding.
You led the Aliens in Antarctica program, and this has changed how Antarctica is managed. Can you tell us about that program as well?
We managed to stop little green men from arriving in Antarctica. They just don't come anymore.
That's good.
Seriously, if you search aliens in Antarctica, you come up with all these conspiracy sites about little green Martians. And, as we know, what we're looking for on Mars is whether there's bacteria or life or evidence of bacteria in the past, not green Martians. But one of the things that it began in the islands, was we realised that people had inadvertently taken in seeds and insects and things like that, and so these plants, if they've come from the sort of temperate conditions, you take them to somewhere cold. Sometimes they may not do well, but sometimes they do really, really well. And we're going, well, how do we get those things in? And it turns out they hitchhike, because these islands have been isolated by the biggest deep blue that you can imagine, which is the Southern Ocean.
Yeah.
The Southern Ocean emerged was formed when Australia and Africa broke off from Antarctica and the big Gondwana breakup, and also finally when South America separated from Antarctica, the little tail bit, and the Drake Passage was formed. And so suddenly you've got this ocean where there's no land that stops it, and the water just goes round and round and round, and the biggest waves you find in the world are in the Southern Ocean because there's no land bit stopping it. So it's the biggest deep blue.
Yeah.
So when you're sailing across it, it looks grey. But it's this barrier to things, and only the toughest things would get across this barrier, either by birds and birds' tummies, or on their feathers, or in the wind. And suddenly you have humans in ships and things that don't have the ability to disperse by by animals or by the wind, suddenly get hitchhike.
Yeah.
And so that's where the Aliens in Antarctica program came, and we started looking to see what people were carrying. And it's really high-tech science. It's science done with a vacuum cleaner, and you're vacuuming people's boots, and you're vacuuming their socks and their gloves. And the worst bit was when I vacuumed someone's shoe and out came a piece of skin off a blister.
Oh, yeah, that's not the best.
That was gross. And what seed is this? No, it's not. I don't want to do it ever again, because people put unmentionable things in their pockets.
Yeah, good point.
And you know what? Snot just does not germinate.
Yeah.
So we're trying to germinate these seeds, and like, what seed is this? But it turned out to be snot. And we found that the worst people for carrying things were scientists. So they were carrying lots and lots of seeds compared to maybe a tradie who's going down to Antarctica to repair something in a hut, or repair a building, or build a new building. And the reason why is that the scientists were going down, they have an affinity with outdoors. And even if you're a physicist, there's a good chance that a physicist scientist will like to go running in national park or things like that. And I think the worst one was actually a geologist, and he just packed his favorite pair of socks, and there were like 300 seeds on this man's socks. There were so many. It's like, how do you even put these socks on? They're just like some echidna socks covered in grass seeds. But also, like, people like meteorologists will often have their equipment out at a runway and
Yeah.
an airport. And airports are usually just grass and weeds, and they just all fly into their boxes. And so, yeah, scientists turned out to be the worst. But we had a whole lot of scientists from lots and lots of countries involved, and we had like 22 ships involved, and we surveyed everybody going to Antarctica, the tourists and
That's
scientists
amazing.
and the supporting people. And then what came out of that is that we had this huge body of science all published in, scientific papers, which no one reads except scientists. Um, but we took that information and collectively, scientists from many nations wrote a manual for all the Antarctic treaty nations.
Yeah.
And it's not called the Aliens in Antarctica Manual, unfortunately. It's called the Non-Native Species Manual. But it tells you what the science tells you, and then it comes up with solutions. And one of the really nice things about being at the Antarctic Division is I get to be what's called an applied ecologist. I get to apply the solutions. And so, after climbing all over cargo and vacuuming people's socks and all sorts of stuff, I got to sit down with the people who do the cargo and go, well, how do you bring cargo in? And we designed a system to prevent seeds and um, flies and anything going to Antarctica. And they had to build a new cargo facility. And here I am talking about how to design cargo facilities. And I had to fight for people to, the Antarctic Division to spend money on these doors that moved really, really fast, these roller doors, so that, they move so fast that there's no chance of rats getting into the cargo facility. So Australia has the best Antarctic biosecurity cargo facility in any of the Antarctic nations, and
Wow, that's
just
amazing.
part of it. And that's the great thing about being an applied ecologist is you get to solve problems with people.
That's
Um,
fantastic. So, through your work, you've changed how people work and visit Antarctica. How has being in these places changed you? You said before the first time you went, you realised I'm not in Australia anymore. When you spend so much time in these remote places, which are wilderness, when you come back to Australia, how much has it changed you?
I know you start to really value the special places in Australia, and I'm attracted to wilderness, and but I'm also attracted to small things, and so yeah, I remember sitting in a beer garden, and looking at the stone wall and going, "Oh, it's covered in mosses and lichens." I suppose I really enjoy seeing things. Living in Tassie, it's great because you can go snorkeling and see so much wonderful things in the near shore here, and you can see, go for a walk on the beach, and there's a good chance there's a dolphin jumping out of the ocean, or you can see seahorses as you go snorkeling. So those things are really, really important to me. But also, particularly working on Macquarie Island, the little things, the mosses and the lichens and the algae, and looking for tiny little things, and you realise that ecosystems are made up of big things as well as the little things. And so, yeah, I really appreciate nature. And I suppose it also teaches you to be comfortable in your own skin, in that often you're working either by yourself or just with one other person. I had this fantastic colleague work with me all summer, Patty. Um, Patty Virtue's her name, and we really enjoyed each other's company, and we also enjoyed just being quiet out in these places. And you come back and you find the same sort of peace in being in nature, just being able to sit and just look at a butterfly, or go for a swim and look at the kelp that you're swimming over and things like that. Get to appreciate the quiet of nature as well.
Does the built world we've created come as a bit of a shock, seeing all these big things and so many people? And
Well, when you're sailing back, one of the first things you do, and I sailed back on Aurora Australis on the second last voyage, um, before you actually see Tasmania, the first thing you do is you smell the eucalypts.
Wow.
And suddenly it's like, wow. And then you see the green, and so much green. And so your senses are quite heightened. And then you have to relearn how to cross a road and not get run over, and what's this thing called traffic lights. And you've got to, yeah. And the station I was at was a lot of people. It was over sort of somewhere between 60 and 80 people over the summer. So you're not completely isolated, but we're just so fortunate. We had so much support this summer that, and this is like dream come true for Antarctic scientists, was that you'd wake up at 7 o'clock and you'd have brekkie at 7:30 and you'd meet with your team, and then you'd wait for what the plan was for the day, because there's so many different science projects and people had to go all sorts of places, and you'd wait for that plan to come out, and then you go, right, I'm on a helicopter at 9 o'clock. And so you'd get all your stuff ready, you're racing, and you get to the helipad, and then in 10 minutes later you're in Antarctica, and the helicopter flies away, and then it's just Patty and myself in Antarctica, and no one else is there. And
Wow.
you just go, wow, my job is to see what's in Antarctica and explore. It's like, how good is that as a job? It's just brilliant.
Yeah, that's absolutely amazing. And you work in remote places, and like you said, you look at lots of small things, but your research reaches people all over the planet. You had a report this year that reached over 1 billion people. This was documenting a heat wave in Antarctica. You wrote, this summer, a heat wave across Antarctica saw temperatures soar above average. Casey Station had its highest temperature ever, reaching a maximum of 9.2 degrees Celsius. And the highest temperature in Antarctica was 20.75 degrees Celsius on 9th of February. That's phenomenal. There would have been places in Australia colder.
Yeah, and that's one of these extreme events. So where I was in the Vestervold Hills, that's where we had days of only only 6 degrees, which was pretty amazing, but rain. And then, one of the amazing things about Antarctica is that you have this international team that you can tap into, and you have people with lots of different skills. And so I had a colleague at the University of Wollongong who I was in touch with. There's another sort of Moss person, and she was going, wow, look at what's happening at Casey, and I was telling her what's happening where I was. And then we saw some other colleagues who work in the Chilean program were saying, this is what's happening here, and the records from the Argentinian stations. And then I could, and Antarctica has amazing communications nowadays. So you just pick up a phone. I phoned my colleague who's a physicist, and he was able to sort of look at satellite data and look at reconstructions of weather, and that's when we realised this heat wave was moving around the entire continent. So it began just below the Indian Ocean, and then went slowly around, and then by the time it got to the tail, it was like 20 degrees.
That's incredible.
And so we published the paper really quickly, which was unusual. And then we talked to some people. We wrote some general science stories, and it was just when COVID-19 was dominating the newspapers, and what we didn't realise was that people wanted to read something else. And so the reach was over 900 different media outlets and newspapers and TV and radio across the world, and in total it was 13% of the population of the world was reading about heat waves in Antarctica. So
that's an incredible achievement.
It was nice to be able to tell a story, and in that story were the good bits, where there was the Moss's recovery, but it just shows you how people were interested in the natural world, and Antarctica being a special place.
Yeah. And I think people want to believe that these remote places are still okay, that things are still possible. it's possible that their kids could live a life like yours and go out and see these places and discover new things. So I think that reaches people to hear about Antarctica. I get really excited to hear about Antarctica. You list your career goals as communicate the importance of Antarctica to science and the world. For people that want these places to stay wild and possible, what's next?
I suspect people, I mean, so the Antarctic Treaty is this amazing arrangement between countries. The best treaty in the world is actually the treaty to stop the ozone hole. That's been the most successful treaty, where everyone signed up and we got rid of these chemicals in the atmosphere which were causing the breakdown of the ozone hole, or the breakdown and creation of the ozone hole. But about the second best treaty is the Antarctic Treaty, and all these nations get together and they're devoted to Antarctica being a place of devoted to peace and science. And there's the Antarctic Treaty, and the Antarctic Treaty meets every 12 months and they discuss that. And so if countries go and represent their people at the treaty, and so if you think Antarctica is really important, and I think it is, I think it's in people's heart that they know Antarctica is important, then you have to be an active citizen and make sure that the people who represent you represent your values. It's not a natural thing, it's a human value thing. And so if these places are important to you, you need to make sure the people who represent you represent your values.
Are there other ways people can learn about these places and get actively involved, particularly while they're at home or in isolation, or trying to find things that they can get involved in?
There's so many avenues to get involved in looking after the planet, and sort of the idea about having global awareness, but also being locally active. And so, look local, I think, is the first thing I would advise people to do. What can you do in your environment that improves it?
Yeah.
Can you be in your local land care group and weed the local gully? Can you stop plastics getting into the ocean? Because one of the things we now know is that plastics and their breakdown products, such as microplastics, are everywhere, including Antarctica. So can you go to your local beach and clean up Australia Day and participate in not letting plastics get into the environment? Can you live a life where you've reduced your carbon? One of the amazing things that the COVID-19 thing has showed us is that as we've needed to be good community members to stay home, we've still stayed connected. And people are learning not to travel as much but still be connected. Just yesterday I was part of an Antarctic conference, and will be tonight as well. The conference is still happening, but it's all online, and so I get to see all my international colleagues through a computer screen, and I don't need to use those carbon miles to be connected. And we've learned that we can value our local space. We can value our local neighbourhood and our local bushland and our local waterways and beaches, and we don't need to go to Bali to have an enjoyable life. So we can reduce our carbon footprint, and we can look after our local environment, and that will have a flow-on effect to Antarctica.
That's absolutely fantastic. Before we finish up, is there anything you think that people really need to know about Antarctica and these subantarctic islands just before we finish?
I like to see Antarctica as the centre of the planet. I'm a bit biased, but it really is important. One, it's the little canary. Actually, it's not little; it's a giant canary in in terms of its signals. It's very important, and sort of it impacts the rest of the planet. It controls the climate. It controls heat being distributed around the world in terms of heat being transferred along ocean lines that connect Antarctica with the Arctic. So it's really important to keep an eye on it. And it controls so much of our life that we don't know, particularly if you're in the southern states of Australia. When a cold front comes through, it's coming from Antarctica. So, to understand it's we don't see it, but it's really important in our day-to-day lives. And as for the little islands, there's little jewels in the Southern Ocean that got nothing to do with us. They're places for seals and penguins and seabirds, and occasionally we get to visit them.
Oh, that's absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us on the podcast series. And I've learned a lot from it. And thank you for everything that you do.
Thank you very much, Tracy. It's been a delight.
Thank you for listening to the Deep Blue On My Doorstep podcast. Don't forget to check out our website at events.unsw.edu.au, where you'll find all the photographs from this podcast series featuring the beautiful places that we've been discussing and the organisms found in these blue spaces.